Now that we've learned about clausulae and cadences and the invertible counterpoint that can take place among the three upper clausulae, soprano, alto, and tenor, we're going to now take all of these ideas and put them into practical action by composing a phrase that implements all of these patterns in their proper locations. What do I mean by that? If you remember, when we discussed the soprano, alto, and tenor cadences, when we take one of these upper clausulae and place them in the bass, they produce a cadence that has weaker closure than a formal cadence. So we have different degrees of hierarchy and closure here, to the extent that a soprano, alto, and tenor cadence appears at the beginning of a phrase or mid-phrase, and then the formal closes, that is to say the composta cadence or the doppia cadence, those appear at the end. So we're going to take those patterns and compose a phrase of 8 measures plus a downbeat using only these patterns. And the other consideration will be we want to modulate to the key of the dominant. Our chosen key is A minor. We'll do this in the minor mode, and we're going to modulate to the key of the dominant midway and then produce a formal close in that key in measure 9 by having a perfect authentic cadence in E minor. So we'll do this just by composing cadences looking only at the bass. So first step, a soprano cadence that simply goes do, ti, do, a very common way for beginning pieces in the Baroque and later parts of the 18th century. Now I want to continue in A minor, but not produce a strong cadence. So I have available to me 2 other cadence types, the alto cadence and tenor cadence. So we'll move on to an alto cadence next. Fa, fa, me. Before proceeding any further with our phrase construction, let me go in and add some figures for these cadences in order to clarify the specific harmony for our realization. So for the G sharp, the dominant, first dominant introduced, we'll begin with a 6-3 and then move on to a 6-5, which has implications for one of the upper clausulae, which we'll see momentarily. And then moving over to measure 3, you see the simplest harmonization for an alto cadence would be to have a 6-3 chord on scale degree 3 and a 6-4-2 with, of course, the raised fourth, which is the leading tone. We'll worry about the second chord in measure 2 in just a moment. First, I want to decide on a soprano part, choosing a clausula for the soprano part in measure 1 to the downbeat of measure 2, and then for measure 3. And we're not going to choose one simply at random, but in such a way that invertible counterpoint figures into the picture. Now, what do I mean by that? We have so far a soprano cadence with a soprano clausula in the bass, and then an alto cadence with an alto clausula in the bass. Well, we can create invertible counterpoint across measures 1 and 3 by swapping the respective clausulae in measure 1 and measure 3. So the alto is now currently in the bass, and we can begin with an alto clausula in the soprano part, in such a way that there's a kind of invertible counterpoint that obtains between measures 1 and 3. And then similarly, I can take a soprano clausula and place it in the soprano part in measure 3, in this way forming a kind of exchange through the first 3 measures. Now, as for the second chord in measure 2, that derives from the fact that I chose a longer version of the alto cadence one which features 2 scale degree 4s in the bass, those 2 Ds, and this was chosen because I knew I would be using a alto clausula followed by a soprano clausula in the upper part, and a gap would be produced. You see there's a gap in between the two, and this longer version of the alto cadence allows us to fill in that gap, at least in part, with a 7/6 suspension. So the C from the alto clausula is suspended over, forming a dissonant 7th that needs to resolve down, and I'm going to use the lowered form of scale degree 2, producing a Neapolitan 6 chord, which is fitting with the style that we will eventually be aiming for. More on that in a moment. So we're nearly halfway through with our phrase, and we have one measure left to fill within A minor in order to have half in A minor and then half in E minor. Well, we've already used a soprano cadence and an alto cadence, and in order to fill out the rest of the space, conveniently we can use the remaining cadence, and that is the tenor. The bass could simply fall down to B and then to A to produce a tenor cadence, and I'll simply use the harmonization that we saw in Walter, which is to have a 7/6 suspension over scale degree 2 and then down to the tonic. Now if you notice, we already have a soprano clausula in measure 3. In order to produce that 7/6 suspension in measure 4, I need only hold over that A that's already there, resolve down again and back up to A, and now we see that our soprano clausula in measure 3 ends up extending across into measure 4 in the form of a kind of doppia version of the soprano clausula, while the bass has a first alto cadence and followed by a tenor cadence, and then if we group those two together, we might even understand them as a long version of a tenor cadence, to the extent that that's the cadence with which this micro phrase ends. Before worrying about how to produce a modulation to the key of the dominant and continuing, let's listen to the work that we have done so far. You can hear a real sense of direction and coherence in these 4 measures, and it owes not only to the fact that, for example, we have a largely stepwise descent in our soprano part from scale degree 5 down to the tonic, and then a similar descent in the bass from 4 down to the tonic. It's rounded off to the extent that we begin with a root position tonic and we return to a root position tonic, but while all of this is going on, we are also producing a sense of imitation through the between the outer parts, through those clausulae, that invertible counterpoint that is built into the patterns themselves. And those same patterns will allow us to solve the remaining problems in this phrase construction, including producing a modulation to the dominant. A very simple and efficient means for doing so would be to take this tonic in measure 4, the chord with which we ended, and treat it as a pivot chord. But I don't want to think about this simply in terms of understanding the chord in the context of the new key, but how the chord in the new key is part of a pattern in itself. Well, if I want to understand the bass A in E minor, it will become scale degree 4. And with that observation comes immediately the possibility to proceed from that A with an alto cadence in E minor. Then the next step becomes figuring out what kind of alto cadence variant I can use that begins with a 5/3 triad on scale degree 4. Well, it turns out that our work has already been partly finished if we just take a step back and look at our alto cadence from measures 2 to 3, that alto cadence in A minor, even though we have a 7/6 suspension, also begins with a 4 chord in Roman numeral terms. We have D minor on beat 3 of measure 2. Well, if we produce a transposition such that the A minor in measure 4 becomes equivalent to the D minor in measure 2, we can simply copy, paste, and transpose that alto cadence from A minor into the key of E minor. So if I do this just in the bass, first our A will get repeated, and in this way what we've essentially done is taken this much and then copied it over into the key of E minor. Now, of course, we're not simply going to mindlessly copy and paste. There are some changes and differences that we need to pay close attention to. For example, the chord on beat 3 of measure 2 is a 7 chord, whereas on beat 3 of measure 4, of course, that is a root position tonic. It's the closing off of a phrase, so that's an essential difference. And aside from these practical considerations, just a kind of general observation in Bach's compositional practice, he absolutely reuses patterns frequently within the context of a single piece through these transposition effects, but it's always a kind of varied transposition. Each time there will be some kind of change so that there's an element of consistency and continuity, but then variation that takes place across that consistency and continuity. So if we apply these principles here, let's see if we can just take measure 3 and adapt it as simply as possible to measure 5. Well, here we don't really need to change anything at all. This will be a 6 chord, a tonic 6 chord in E minor, and this a 6, which needs to be raised now, F sharp, 4 to account for D sharp, and then a 2. So that remains the same. And it turns out really the main change that needs to take place here is on beat 4 of measure 4, where we formerly had a Neapolitan 6 chord. Well, here we will add a 6, but not a Neapolitan 6th, although this chord, as we'll see, will be very characteristic of the style that we will eventually aim for with this piece. It would be less opportune and effective to use an F natural, a Neapolitan 6 chord, going into E minor, to the extent that we want to prime the ear to anticipate a modulation as early as possible. And we can do that by implementing an F sharp, a 6 chord. So you see, our pattern, our alto cadence, has essentially stayed the same. We have a 6 chord moving to a 6/4/2 and then to another 6 chord, and that was the same in the alto cadence. The real essential difference is the lack of a 7 chord in the E minor alto cadence, and then the alteration of the 2 chord, which is not a Neapolitan but just a diatonic 2/6. Now, as a next step, I'd like for you to pause the video and see if you can come up with the solution for the soprano part in the remainder of measure 4 and then measure 5. Again, thinking about this idea of a varied transposition. We are copying over or adapting measures 2 and 3 into 4 and 5. So try it yourselves and start the video again when you're done. Now, if you did this correctly, your soprano part here should look exactly like this. F sharp, moving down to D sharp and back up to the new tonic E. And in terms of the varied transposition, B flat has now become F sharp, G sharp has become D sharp, and A becomes E. Now, in order to continue with our modulation and to continue this idea of a varied transposition, our alto cadence in A minor in measures 2 to 3 continued on with a tenor cadence in that same key as a way of rounding off the phrase, and one might say that an expectation has been built in for that to happen now again in E minor, to the extent that the ear picks up on the fact that the alto cadence that we have composed here in E minor is indeed a varied transposition of the one we heard before in A minor. So in order to continue this, I could simply copy, paste, transpose, and adapt the tenor cadence from measure 4 into measure 6, which would bring us to a rounding off of the phrase here. But once again, I want to insist on the idea of a varied transposition. We will still end up completing a tenor cadence, but stretch it out in such a way that we are producing a subtle variation. And what do I mean by that? Well, rather than proceed immediately down to F sharp in the bass, I'm going to hold on to that G before descending. And this will also allow us to close our E minor microphrase on a metrically strong downbeat, which has implications for the final cadence coming down the road in measure 9. And of course, I have anticipated many of these things in advance. Now, with the addition of a second G in this tenor cadence in E minor, it may look like I've actually added another chord compared with the tenor cadence in A minor. But if we go back and look at the beginning of measure 4, we actually had two chords in the first half of that measure, beats 1 and 2, a 2/7 chord in Roman numeral terms that resolves, whose suspension resolves down to the leading tone to produce a 7 diminished 6 chord. So there's a kind of predominant, if you will, that resolves to a dominant function chord over the course of 2 beats. Well, we're going to take that same idea, or we have taken that same idea, and simply stretched it out so that the predominant before, that lasted only 1 beat, now will last 2 beats here, and then the 7 diminished 6 also gets 2 beats here before closing. Now, a particular variant of the tenor cadence that features scale degree 3 in this way takes a 6, 4, 2 with a sharp. So in the minor mode, whenever we have a 7th chord on scale degree 4, it will, and we are dealing with the melodic minor scale, it will always produce a dominant 7th quality chord. What do I mean by that? Well, this 6 sharp 4/2 chord in measure 6 with G in the bass, the notes in that chord consist of A, C sharp, E, and G. In a different context, that could function as a dominant of D, but in a melodic minor context, this is a frequently sounding 7th chord where we have raised scale degree 6 before it moves on to the leading tone. And the context for that raised scale degree 6 here happens to be a variant of the soprano clausula, which we also saw in the Walter. And here, we too will use it in the soprano part, La, Ti, Do. So in the same way that we adapted the bass part of the alto cadence and tenor cadence from A minor into E minor, we are also preserving the upper parts where the soprano clausula here is repeated with variation there and then here. Let's hear all of our work thus far before adding the last concluding cadence. In order to close off our phrase, we now need a formal cadence, and we are going to compose a variation of a composta or compound cadence that we encountered in the Walter. His second example here from the Clausula formalis perfectissima category features the common 4-5-1 bass with a 2-1-1-7-1 soprano clausula. We'll be using this and also the same essential harmonic content. Here we have a 6-3 chord, which ends up becoming a 7 chord over scale degree 4 before moving to the suspended form of the dominant in the next bar. So we're going to have the same essential structure, a 2-1-7-1 soprano, a 4-5-1 bass, and the harmony will be a 6 chord moving to a 7 chord and then to a suspension based dominant resolving to a dominant triad and then a tonic. We're just going to add just a couple of changes. So going back, the first change will result from the fact that now would be a good time to exploit the possibility for a Neapolitan 6 chord in the context of E minor. So the Walter formula had a 6 chord here, and rather than use a simple diatonic to diminished 6, our scale degree 2 will be flat. So we're still using the re, do, do, ti, do, except we're modifying it to the context of a Neapolitan 6 chord, so it will be ra, do, do, ti, do. Now we will move on to a 7th chord, but as is characteristic of this style, and also to introduce you to another variant of this cadence type, we frequently encounter a 4 sharp 4-5 in the bass in this composta variant, and when we do, that sharp 4 is harmonized with a fully diminished 7th chord. So a diminished 7th chord on scale degree sharp 4 or a sharp 4 diminished 7, and then for the composta we'll have a 6-4 chord resolving to the dominant triad, and the soprano will go ra, do, do, ti, do. So let's listen to all of our work thus far. Now, if we add just one more context to our understanding of clausulae and cadences, we'll be able to compose the structure for an entire piece. And that other context consists of how cadences, here defined in terms of soprano, alto, and tenor cadence, how they may be plugged into larger sequential patterns. One very common element of Bach's compositional process is to feature middle episodes in a variety of genres that consist of largely sequential patterning. So we're going to follow Bach's model here by composing a long sequential episode that moves through the related keys of the overall A minor tonality. We've begun this piece in a fairly standard way of establishing the primary tonality, and then that primary tonality is dominant. And now we'll move into a sequential episode, which, as I say, is a common feature of Bach's compositional process. And in order to visit the related keys of A minor, we're going to frame the entire thing essentially in the context of the key of its subdominant. Our sequential episode will begin in D minor and end in D minor. And in order to compose it out, we will essentially use only one cadence type, and that is the soprano cadence, a shortened version of it. So immediately after our formal cadence in E minor, we're going to modulate to D minor simply via a soprano cadence in that key that goes scale degree 7 to 1 in the bass with a 6/5 chord over that C sharp. I'm going to pair that soprano clausula in the bass with an alto clausula in the soprano part. Now, to turn this into a sequence, we essentially have to apply principles of transposition. We're going to copy, paste, and transpose the soprano cadence in D minor to the key of C major, the relative major of A minor, with a 6/5 chord now on B, and then in the soprano part, that F stays to produce another alto clausula now in the key of C major. So we've produced a short sequence by combining two soprano cadences, one in D minor, the other in C major, but we have also in the process plugged in the soprano cadence into a larger sequential pattern, and that sequential pattern is a descending fifth sequence. If we go in and examine the underlying root motion of this entire passage, our first chord with C sharp in the bass has a root of A, which moves to D, then to G, and then C. So we have composed a descending fifth sequence that fits a soprano cadence into each leg of the sequence. The interval of transposition in a descending fifth sequence, like many sequences, is down a step. So we have taken the soprano cadence and transposed it down a step. We're going to follow the same idea of transposing soprano cadences successively, but now we're going to alter the interval of transposition to a third, falling thirds. This is an interval of transposition that exists in a particular kind of sequence that you may have otherwise learned as the Pachelbel sequence, which goes down. I'll just illustrate it on the side here by way of review. For example, if we do this in C major, that is its main root motion, and you'll notice that the interval of transposition is down a third. So we're going to take the same idea from the Pachelbel sequence, which also goes by the name of the Romanesca schema, as Robert Yerdingen has called it, and we're going to plug in a soprano cadence into this interval of transposition by third. So having ended in C major, applying this principle, we momentarily will move back to A minor, still with a 6/5 chord on every dominant, and my soprano part need only move down by step to produce still an alto clausula. From A minor then, we transpose the soprano cadence down another third, the 6/5 on E, and that brings us to F major, and we have to indicate that that 5 is flat. And if you remember from the previous video, I could have simply illustrated all of these 6/5 chords that feature a tritone with a 5 flat by itself. That's a common practice for indicating a 6/5 chord with a tritone. So from A minor to F major, and then finally back to D minor, with which this sequential episode began, by going down yet another third. And the soprano part does what it has been doing all along, that is to produce alto clausulae. And you notice that by chaining together all of these soprano cadences, we end up composing out a stepwise descent in the soprano part throughout this entire episode. Having composed a sequential episode that begins and ends in D minor, we're now going to further solidify that key through a formal cadence in D minor, in the key of the subdominant, mirroring the previous formal cadence in the key of the dominant E minor earlier. And here too, it will be a variant of a composta cadence. Another way of varying these cadences was to combine smaller formal cadences together, or a cadence with weaker closure with a cadence of stronger closure, in order to produce longer cadential episodes, or longer versions of these cadences. We'll do that here by combining an alto cadence with a compound cadence. And once again, we will bring back the Neapolitan 6th chord, which has been a common feature of the formal cadences so far in our piece. So we'll compose first a long alto cadence that mirrors the alto cadence first used in measures 2 and 3, with the Neapolitan 6th chord moving to a 6, 4, 2, and I need to just make some room here. So that scale degree 4, of course, will move down to scale degree 3. And now here we're going to fit an accelerated compound cadence. 6, and then here the 6, 4, 5, 3 suspension based dominant, and then to the tonic. Our soprano part will also mirror measures 2 and 3. Well, first of all, we need to move into a higher register because we've gotten quite low at this point, and that, combined with this idea of mirroring this passage with measures 2 and 3, will lead us to have the Neapolitan there on beat 4, in the same way that we have the lowered 2nd scale degree on beat 4 of measure 2, and then from there, similarly down to the leading tone, which resolves back up to the tonic, and then to the leading tone in the composta cadence, and back up again. We have just 2 more passages to compose in order to finish our piece, or the structure for our piece. Before doing that, let's go back and listen to all of our work so far. finish the structure for our piece, we need two more things. We need to modulate back to the home key of A minor, and then finally produce one more concluding formal cadence in that home key. To solve both problems, we're going to revisit ideas and patterns that we've used before. For the first step, to modulate back to A minor, we're going to revisit this idea of plugging in clausulae and cadences in a sequential context. The one change here will be that as we're composing the remainder of the piece, or the structure of the piece, we want to bring back the idea of varied transposition, which we didn't really use in great detail in the sequential episode itself. The idea of varied transposition took place primarily in measures 1 through 9, and we want to bring that back here as well. So what do I mean by that? We can begin to modulate back simply by producing soprano cadences as we have done before. For example, that Pachelbel sequence or Romanesca version of the transposition down a third, applying that to a soprano cadence would bring us back to A minor fairly quickly. And our soprano part would again simply descend stepwise. Fa mi followed by fa me. Well, we can keep that, and there would be nothing wrong with that. It would be entirely correct. But let's say we wanted to introduce this idea of a varied transposition or some variation. We have heard that soprano cadence quite a bit already within our sequential episode in the middle. So we don't want to discard the idea of sequencing altogether because it's a very powerful tool, but rather what we can do is to just change the structure of what is being transposed. And if we remember that the soprano clausula, alto clausula, tenor clausula, and the bass clausula, they're all essentially part of a larger dominant to tonic exchange, one way of producing a variation would be not to have a soprano clausula there in the bass, but to produce a simple cadence with 5-1 in C major. And now, again, from there we can simply move to a soprano cadence in A minor, or we can exploit the opportunity for that C in the bass to initiate a tenor cadence in A minor. So there's essentially still a transposition down a third that takes place, but it's varied rather than simply transpose the 5-1 motion in the bass from C major to A minor. The transposition is accompanied with a variation whereby scale degree 2 in A minor substitutes for scale degree 5. And then bigger picture, there's variation to the extent that we have altered the bass altogether compared with how the sequencing of soprano cadences was treated earlier. Now we need one more big formal cadence in A minor in order to finish the structure for our piece. With this final cadence, I'll introduce you to yet one other variant of a formal cadence, but still we'll be using the Neapolitan 6 chord, which has been a feature of our formal cadences throughout. So here too we will begin with a Neapolitan inflected alto cadence, but one with this rhythmic configuration: 6, 4, 2. Because in the second half of measure 19, we are now going to fit a doppia cadence. So essentially what we're combining here is an alto cadence and a doppia cadence. And this particular doppia variant will feature a re, do, sol bass. You notice the harmonic rhythm in this way becomes similar to the harmonic rhythm in measure 15, that formal cadence we had in D minor. That will be a 6, and then we will have, of course, a suspension-based dominant for this doppia here, and we'll vary it with a 5/4 chord, not a 6/4 chord. Our B flat in the soprano will move down to a G sharp as it did at the beginning of the piece, to an A, and now we just need to make our doppia soprano part fit the second half of the measure. So T, do, T, do. And that is the structure for our entire piece. Let's go back and listen to the entire thing now before we reflect on some things and think about future steps. Even though our piece still contains only two parts, a soprano and a bass, it embodies virtually everything that we have learned so far regarding clausulae, cadences, the context in which clausulae and cadences are used, and how invertible counterpoint figures into clausulae themselves. For the majority of our piece, the soprano and bass may swap with some exceptions. Before addressing its invertibility or potential invertibility, first we need to segment out its essential parts in terms of the various functions that the individual sections of our piece have, because these functions represent the primary contexts in which counterpoint takes place in Bach's music, those contexts being patterning and how that patterning is fit into a larger functional sense. So we've already talked about how we have different varieties of closure. A soprano cadence will not feature the same closure as a doppia cadence. So we have hierarchies of cadential closure, and we also have different phrase structural situations in which these cadences and clausulae are used. For example, we have the sequential episodes, which will go in and mark out in blue, beginning with measure 9, all of that consists of sequential patterning, the idea of sequence returned, in order to modulate back to A minor, if you remember, and that is really the only place in which sequences, properly speaking, were used. In other situations, our soprano, alto, and tenor cadences were used in a largely tonic prolongational setting. For example, the soprano, alto, and tenor essentially just expand tonic harmony. From there, we used the same patterning to modulate to E minor, but that too is not strongly cadential. It's essentially tonic prolongational, now in the key of E minor. And all of the music that remains, which we'll highlight in green, consists of formal cadences. First, the compound cadence in E minor, then there was another compound cadence in D minor, and finally, to close off the piece, another extended formal cadence in A minor. The utility of this segmentation lies not only in the fact that it explains a great deal about the tonal and formal organization of this piece, but also everything highlighted in red and blue essentially contains invertible counterpoint. That's to say, all of the passages that do not use closing cadential formulas are subject to invertible counterpoint. Again, with the occasional modification here and there, but because we have essentially been using soprano, alto, and tenor cadences throughout, the outer voices are invertible. In addition to that, if we were to add a third line, it could appear essentially in any register among those sections that do not feature closing cadences. So for example, just to quickly illustrate the point, if we look at measure 3, I have used a soprano clausula and an alto clausula. That means I can introduce a tenor clausula anywhere, above the soprano, in between soprano and bass, below the bass, because those three clausulae form triple invertible counterpoint. Well, it turns out that that particular kind of counterpoint, the invertibility of outer parts, does not play out in this particular piece. And with that statement, it's now time to unveil the larger context for what we have been working on. This piece that we've composed is actually something of a recomposition. I've reconstructed the compositional process to illustrate the underlying structure for a well-known Bach composition. What we're looking at here is the underlying outer voice structure and harmonic structure for the adagio from Bach's organ work, the Toccata, Adagio, and Fugue in C major, BWV 564. The adagio for this work is very much in the style of a kind of aria or arioso, with a melody and accompaniment that features a very rich solo and figurated melody for the right hand. Let's listen just to the first A minor section. You may have noticed that the right hand and pedal, bass, essentially consist of the melodic content that we recomposed in our earlier compositional exercise. For example, in the right hand, there is that alto clausula paired with a soprano clausula in the bass, followed by the alto in the bass, which is paired with a soprano in the right hand. If you look at the tenor cadence that follows, the right hand seems to be using two clausulae at once. We have this F, this D, which is Fa, that resolves down to 3 in the manner of an alto clausula. But on the strong beat of beat 2, we have this G sharp, which, as part of a soprano clausula, would need to resolve up to the tonic, which comes in delayed there. So we see the richness of the melodic content in the right hand derives very much so from a different conception of counterpoint, and that is this notion of a polyphonic melody that combines clausulae within a single part. Oftentimes, these clausulae are treated or are worked out not simply as melodies, but as structural melodies, where they form the foundation for richer and more complex melodic content. And in this measure here, from BWV 564, this idea is quite palpably and markedly illustrated if we, for example, just try and understand where that G sharp on beat 2 comes from. Now, of course, in a very local context, it comes from that B. Most immediately, it comes from that D in terms of its temporal unfolding. But structurally, where does it come from? Well, if you remember, this, in our recomposition of this was the place where we had a 7/6 suspension over the bass. And the 7 in this case happens to be in the left hand, or the alto part. Within that alto part of the accompaniment, the A technically does not resolve because it is followed by a rest. Well, that's because its resolution has been transferred to the melodic line, so into the soprano part effectively, which happens to be coupled through a polyphonic melody with an alto clausula. And this idea ties very strongly to the notion and practice of diminution, the idea of taking something structural, a note of longer duration, and breaking it up into rhythms of shorter duration, and this inevitably involves a voice moving into the space of another voice. So we see here clearly illustrated in the rich right hand solo part, an alto clausula and a soprano clausula being combined in such a way that the soprano part momentarily dips into the alto part's voice or clausula. And while the soprano is doing this diminution, you may notice that the bass itself is performing its own diminution. It doesn't simply go re to do, B to A in finishing this tenor cadence, but there's a momentary leap to scale degree 5, so there's a sol to do. Now very locally, this looks like it's a simple cadence because we have root motion 5 to 1, but really what's happening here is that we are seeing and hearing a diminuted form of the tenor cadence that goes scale degree 2 to 5 to 1, so that the tenor is moving momentarily is momentarily using a bass clausula. With this much at hand, you are more than well equipped to begin to do some exercises on your own. So finish this segment with this reflection on this measure, and more details and further instructions for what is to come are forthcoming on Canvas.